The scorn of 100 whispers followed Abigail Preston wherever she went in Owyhee, Nevada. It was 1878, and in a territory where a woman's worth was measured by the children she bore, Abigail's empty cradle had become her cross to bear. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as she hurried toward the general store, her eyes fixed on the weathered boardwalk beneath her feet. "Morning, Mrs. Preston," called Mr. Thompson from his barber shop, his voice carrying a false cheerfulness that couldn't mask the pity in his eyes. Abigail nodded politely, but kept moving. 7 years of marriage without a child had transformed her from the town's promising young bride into its greatest disappointment. Her husband Thomas had been patient at first, then distant, and finally cruel. When pneumonia took him last winter, the town's sympathy had been perfunctory at best. "The good Lord knows what he's doing," Reverend Miller had said at the funeral. "Some women aren't meant for motherhood." The words, meant as comfort perhaps, had cut deeper than the bitter Nevada wind. The bell above Owyhee General Store jingled as Abigail entered. Mrs. Holloway, the owner's wife, was deep in conversation with Eunice Blackburn and Martha Winters, the town's most prolific gossips. "Well, speak of the devil," Eunice murmured, not bothering to lower her voice as Abigail approached the counter. "Good morning, ladies," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the flush creeping up her neck. "I need flour, coffee, and some sugar, please." Mrs. Holloway nodded curtly. "Planning a special dinner, got company coming." The question seemed innocent enough, but Abigail recognized the implication. A widow with no children and no prospects was an anomaly in Owyhee, a burden on the community's resources. "Just restocking my pantry," Abigail replied, placing her coins on the counter. "Shame about your situation," Martha said, clicking her tongue sympathetically. "My Sarah just had her 5th. The Lord does bless some more abundantly than others." Abigail bit her tongue. She'd learned that responding only encouraged them. Instead, she gathered her purchases and headed for the door, pausing only when Mrs. Holloway called after her. "Mail came yesterday. There's a letter for you." Abigail turned back, surprised. She had no family to write to her, no friends beyond Owyhee's borders. Mrs. Holloway handed over a thick envelope, its edges slightly worn from travel. "Thank you," Abigail said, tucking it into her basket before stepping back into the harsh sunlight. The walk home took her past the schoolhouse, where children played in the yard, their laughter like salt in a wound. Her small house sat on the outskirts of town, once a hopeful starter home, now a lonely monument to failed dreams. Thomas had built it himself, promising to add rooms as their family grew. Now the empty bedrooms echoed with silence. Once inside, Abigail set her purchases on the kitchen table and sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted from the weight of the town stairs. She pulled out the mysterious letter, examining the unfamiliar handwriting. The return address read Y. Keller, Circle K Ranch, Elko County, Nevada. Breaking the seal, she unfolded several pages of neat, masculine script. "Dear Mrs. Preston, you don't know me, but I'm writing on behalf of your late husband's cousin, James Preston. I regret to inform you that James passed away last month after a brief illness. In his final days, he spoke often of his cousin Thomas and expressed regret that they had lost touch over the years. James left no immediate family, but in his will he bequeathed his property, a modest cattle ranch about 20 miles north of Owyhee, to Thomas, or his next of kin. Upon inquiring in town, I learned of Thomas's passing and of you, his widow. As the executor of James's estate, I'm writing to inform you that the ranch and its assets now legally belong to you. The property includes 150 acres, a small herd of cattle, a habitable house, and various outbuildings. I understand this news may come as a shock. If you wish to claim your inheritance, please reply at your earliest convenience. If you prefer to sell, I can assist with finding a buyer. Respectfully yours, Yates Keller, foreman, Circle K Ranch. Abigail read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. Thomas had mentioned a cousin once or twice, but never in any detail. A ranch, her own property. The possibility of escape from Owyhee's judgment was almost too much to comprehend. She reached for paper and pen before she could lose her nerve. Dear Mr. Keller, your letter arrived today, bringing news that has left me quite astonished. While Thomas occasionally mentioned his cousin James, I never had the pleasure of making his acquaintance. I am deeply sorry to hear of his passing, but grateful for his generous bequest. As a widow with no children, my situation in Owyhee has become increasingly difficult. The prospect of a fresh start is more welcome than you could know. I would very much like to see the property before making any decisions. If it wouldn't be too much trouble, might we arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience? Sincerely, Abigail Preston. 3 days later, Abigail waited nervously on the platform of Owyhee's small train station. Her decision to visit the ranch had spread through town like wildfire, fueling speculation that ranged from practical to scandalous. Going to meet a man alone? Reverend Miller had asked when she'd informed him of her plans. Mrs. Preston, I must caution you against such impropriety. It's business, Reverend, she'd replied firmly. I'm inspecting property that now legally belongs to me. Her response had surprised them both. After years of deferring to others' judgments, standing her ground felt foreign yet satisfying. The distant whistle of the approaching train sent a shiver of anticipation through her. This was either madness or the first sensible decision she'd made since Thomas's death. Either way, it was her decision alone. As the train slowed to a stop, passengers began disembarking. Abigail scanned the crowd, looking for someone who might be Yates Keller, though she had no idea what to expect. Mrs. Preston, the deep voice came from behind her. Abigail turned to find a tall man in a worn Stetson watching her with curious blue eyes. His face was tanned from long days under the sun, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. He wasn't conventionally handsome. His nose had clearly been broken at least once, and a scar ran along his jaw, but there was something compelling about his steady gaze. Mr. Keller, she asked, extending her hand. He nodded, removing his hat. Madam, hope I didn't startle you. I came in on yesterday's train to make arrangements. His handshake was firm but gentle. Got the wagon ready whenever you are. Abigail nodded, suddenly nervous. I'm ready now. The journey to James Preston's ranch took most of the day. At first, they rode in awkward silence, but gradually the conversation found its rhythm. Yates explained that he'd worked for various ranches across Nevada before settling at the Circle K 7 years ago. James was a good man, he said as they passed a particularly beautiful stretch of sagebrush country. Tough but fair, taught me most of what I know about cattle. Did he ever mention Thomas? Abigail asked. Some said they were close as boys but had some falling out over family land back east. James regretted that in his final days. Abigail nodded, thinking of Thomas's stubborn pride. My husband could hold a grudge longer than most. Yates glanced at her, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Begging your pardon, madam, but how do you feel about ranching? It's hard work, especially for someone on their own. I'm no stranger to hard work, Mr. Keller, she replied, straightening her shoulders, and I learn quickly. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Never doubted that, Mrs. Preston. Just wanted to be straight with you about what you're getting into. As the sun began its descent, they crested a hill, and Yates pulled the wagon to a stop. "There it is," he said, pointing to the valley below. "Preston Ranch." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. A small house with a covered porch stood amid several outbuildings. A creek wound its way through lush pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks golden in the late afternoon light. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It is at that," Yates agreed. James loved this land, worked it till the day he took sick. As they approached the ranch house, Abigail noticed the care that had gone into its maintenance. The porch was swept, the windows clean, smoke curling from the chimney. "Did you do all this?" she asked as Yates helped her down from the wagon. He nodded, a touch of color rising to his cheeks. "Thought you might appreciate coming to a proper home, not just an empty house." The simple kindness nearly undid her. After years of sidelong glances and whispered judgment, genuine consideration felt almost foreign. "Thank you," she managed, blinking back unexpected tears. The interior was simple but comfortable, a large main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast iron stove, 2 bedrooms, and a small study lined with books. Everything was clean and in good repair, if a bit sparse. "I've got a room at the bunkhouse," Yates explained as he showed her around. "Thought I'd stay on till you decide what you want to do with the place. That is, if you're comfortable with that arrangement." Abigail considered this. Propriety dictated she should be scandalized by the suggestion of staying alone on a remote ranch with a man she barely knew. But the alternative, returning to Owyhee without fully exploring this opportunity, was unthinkable. "That would be acceptable, Mr. Keller. I appreciate your consideration." Over the next week, Abigail learned more about ranching than she'd ever imagined possible. Yates proved a patient teacher, showing her the basics of cattle management, explaining the irrigation system James had implemented, and introducing her to the small staff 2 ranch hands named Miguel and Frank who lived in the bunkhouse with Yates. To her surprise, Abigail found herself thriving. The physical work was exhausting but satisfying in a way that her previous life had never been. Each night, she fell into bed with aching muscles and slept more soundly than she had in years. On her 8th day at the ranch, Yates found her in the vegetable garden James had started, which had fallen into neglect during his illness. "You've got a way with plants," he observed, watching as she carefully thinned the rows of carrots. "That garden hasn't looked so promising in months." Abigail smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "I've always loved growing things. In Owyhee, I had a small kitchen garden, but Thomas thought it was a waste of time." Yates frowned slightly. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Preston, but your husband sounds like he might have been a difficult man." The comment should have offended her, but Abigail found herself nodding. "He wasn't always. When we first married, he was kind, even gentle, but as the years passed and I failed to give him children." She trailed off, suddenly aware she was sharing intimate details with a virtual stranger. "That wasn't your fault," Yates said quietly, his voice firm. "Some things aren't meant to be forced." Something in his tone made her look up. There was no pity in his eyes, just a steady certainty that made her throat tighten with emotion. "The town didn't see it that way," she said after a moment. "In Owyhee, a woman who can't bear children is considered less than complete." Yates's expression hardened. "Then Owyhee's a fool place with fool people." He shook his head, seeming to catch himself. "I apologize, Mrs. Preston. That was out of line." "No," Abigail said, surprised by the sudden fierce agreement she felt. "You're right. It is a fool place." The admission felt like throwing open a window in a stuffy room. "And please call me Abigail. If we're going to work together, all this formality seems unnecessary." His smile transformed his face, erasing the weathered lines and making him look years younger. "Abigail, then. And I'm Yates to my friends." That evening they shared a meal on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Abigail found herself talking more freely than she had in years, telling Yates about her childhood in California, her parents' death from influenza when she was 17, her marriage to Thomas at 18. "I thought I loved him," she admitted, watching the first stars appear. "Now I wonder if I was just desperate not to be alone." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Loneliness can make us accept things we shouldn't." "What about you?" Abigail asked. "You've never mentioned a wife or family." A shadow crossed his face. "No wife. Had a sweetheart once, back in Texas. Emily. We were engaged to be married when the war came. I joined up with the Confederacy young and stupid, fighting for a cause I didn't fully understand." His hands tightened around his coffee cup. 2 years later, I came home to find she'd married a Union officer who'd been stationed in our town. Can't blame her. 4 years is a long time to wait, especially when you don't know if your man is coming back. "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly. He shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both acceptance and lingering pain. "It was a lifetime ago. After that, I headed west, figured I'd make a fresh start. Been moving from ranch to ranch ever since, until James gave me a permanent position here." As the days passed, Abigail found herself settling into ranch life with surprising ease. The work was constant but rewarding, and for the first time in years, she felt purposeful. Yates continued to teach her about ranch management, never talking down to her or suggesting the work might be too difficult. 2 weeks after her arrival, Abigail made a decision. She was in the barn, helping Yates treat a calf with an infected leg, when she found the words she'd been considering for days. "I'm staying," she said, holding the calf steady as Yates applied a poultice. "I want to make this ranch work." He looked up, his hands pausing in their task. "You're sure?" "It won't be easy, especially come winter." "I'm sure," she replied, a confidence in her voice that surprised even her. "I've never felt so, right, as I do here. In Owyhee, I was always the barren widow, a object of pity or scorn. Here I'm just me." Yates nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "For what it's worth, I think you'll do just fine. This place needs someone who loves it, and I can see you already do. Will you stay on?" The question came out more hesitantly than she intended. "As foreman, I mean." "I couldn't manage without your experience." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or some deeper emotion she couldn't name. "If you want me to, yes. This place has become home to me too." The next day, they rode into Owyhee together to handle the legal paperwork for Abigail's inheritance. The town seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than when she'd left. Still, she could feel the curious stares as she and Yates made their way to the lawyer's office. "Mrs. Preston," Reverend Miller called, intercepting them outside the bank. "We've been wondering when you'd return to us." "Good morning, Reverend," Abigail replied politely. "I've come to arrange the transfer of my late cousin-in-law's property into my name. I'll be residing at the ranch permanently." The Reverend's eyebrows shot up. "Permanently? But surely a woman alone, Mrs. Preston won't be alone," Yates interrupted, his voice level but with an edge of steel. "The ranch has a full staff, myself included." Reverend Miller looked Yates up and down, his disapproval evident. "And you are?" "Yates Keller, ranch foreman. I see." The Reverend's tone suggested he saw entirely too much. "Mrs. Preston, perhaps we could speak privately about the wisdom of this arrangement." Abigail felt a flush of anger. "There's nothing to discuss, Reverend. My decision is made." As they walked away, she could feel the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her once more. "It's starting already," she murmured. "The gossip." Yates's hand briefly touched the small of her back, a gesture of support that was gone almost as soon as it happened. Let them talk. You don't answer to them anymore. The simple truth of his words straightened her spine. She didn't answer to Owyhee anymore. For the first time in her adult life, Abigail was making choices based on her own desires, not on others' expectations. The legal business took most of the day. By late afternoon, Abigail was officially the owner of Preston Ranch, with all its assets and liabilities. As they prepared to leave town, Mrs. Holloway hurried from the general store to intercept them. "Abigail," she said, a little breathless, "we're all so curious about your plans." "Will you be selling the ranch?" "No," Abigail replied firmly. "I'll be running it myself with Mr. Keller's assistance." Mrs. Holloway's eyes widened. "But that's hardly proper." "A widow, living alone with a man who isn't family. Mr. Keller is my employee," Abigail interrupted, her patience wearing thin. "And I'm hardly alone. There are other ranch hands as well." "Still," Mrs. Holloway persisted, "people will talk." "Let them," Abigail said, surprised by her own boldness. "I've endured worse from this town than a little gossip." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in thought. As the familiar landscape came into view, Abigail felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. This was home now, her home, earned through loss but representing possibility rather than regret. "Thank you," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Yates glanced at her, eyebrows raised in question. "For standing by me today," she clarified. "For not letting them make me feel small." He shook his head, a half-smile on his lips. "You did that yourself, Abigail. I just had the pleasure of watching." Summer turned to autumn, and the ranch settled into a rhythm. Under Abigail's direction, and with Yates's guidance, they prepared for winter, repairing fences, storing hay, preserving garden produce. The vegetable garden flourished under Abigail's care, producing more than enough to see them through the cold months ahead. As the days grew shorter, Abigail and Yates fell into the habit of sharing evenings by the fire. Sometimes they discussed ranch business, but often they simply talked about books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they'd once had. Abigail found herself looking forward to these quiet hours more than she cared to admit. One evening in late October, as the first snow dusted the distant mountains, Yates mentioned receiving a letter from a rancher in California offering him a position as head foreman with significantly higher pay. "Are you considering it?" Abigail asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the sudden hollow feeling in her chest. Yates stared into the fire for a long moment. "Would have jumped at it a year ago," he finally said. "Now I'm not so sure. What's changed?" His eyes met hers across the dimly lit room. "Everything." The single word hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Abigail felt her heart quicken, recognizing the dangerous territory they were approaching. Yates was her employee, her friend, her teacher, but anything more would invite the very scandal Owyhee had predicted. "It's getting late," she said, rising abruptly. "Good night, Yates." She fled to her bedroom, her emotions in turmoil. It wasn't just the impropriety that frightened her, it was the intensity of her own feelings. Somehow, without her noticing, Yates Keller had become essential to her happiness in a way Thomas never had been. The next morning, she avoided being alone with him, busying herself with chores that kept her in the house while he worked with the cattle. By evening, however, a fierce storm had blown in from the mountains, forcing everyone indoors. "Miguel says the north pasture fence is down," Yates reported, stomping snow from his boots as he entered the kitchen where Abigail was preparing dinner. "We'll need to ride out at first light to fix it before any cattle wander off." "I'll come with you," she said, keeping her focus on the stew she was stirring. "Abigail." His voice was gentle but insistent. "Are we going to talk about what happened last night?" She stilled, her back to him. "Nothing happened." Something almost did, he corrected. And you ran. Slowly, she turned to face him. Yates stood just inside the doorway, his hat in his hands, his expression a mixture of concern and something deeper, more vulnerable. "I'm your employer," she said quietly. "Is that all I am to you? An employee?" Abigail closed her eyes briefly. "You know it isn't. But that doesn't change the reality of our situation." Yates stepped closer, still maintaining a respectful distance. "What reality? That you're a widow, that I work for you, or that you're still letting Owyhee decide what's proper for you?" The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Even here, miles from town, Abigail could hear the whispers, the judgment. "It's not that simple," she protested. "It can be," he countered, "if we let it." Before she could respond, a crash of thunder shook the house, and the lamps flickered ominously. Moments later, Miguel burst through the front door, soaked to the skin. "Miss Preston," the creak's rising fast. "Frank's checking the livestock, but we might need to move some animals to higher ground if it gets worse." The personal conversation was instantly forgotten as they rushed to address the emergency. For the next several hours, they worked in the driving rain to secure animals and property against the flooding creek. By midnight, exhausted and drenched, they gathered in the main house to assess the damage. "Lost a section of fence along the creek," Frank reported, gratefully accepting the coffee Abigail handed him. "But the cattle are safe, and the house isn't in danger." "We got lucky," Yates agreed, his clothes dripping onto the kitchen floor despite his attempt to wring them out on the porch. "Could have been much worse." Abigail nodded, wrapping a blanket more tightly around her shoulders. The storm had broken something loose inside her, a realization that life was unpredictable and sometimes dangerously short. Her years with Thomas had taught her that security was an illusion. What mattered was how you lived each day and with whom. As Miguel and Frank headed back to the bunkhouse, taking advantage of a brief lull in the storm, Abigail found herself alone with Yates once more. "You should get some rest," he said, moving toward the door. "Been a long night." "Stay," she said softly. When he turned, surprise evident on his face, she added, "Please, I think we need to finish our conversation." Yates hesitated, then nodded, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. Abigail sat across from him, gathering her courage. "You were right," she began. "I've been letting Owyhee's opinions control me, even from a distance." She took a deep breath. "The truth is, I care for you, Yates, more than I should, perhaps, but I can't seem to help it." His expression softened, hope kindling in his eyes. "I care for you too, Abigail. Have since the day we met, though I fought it for a long while." "What do we do about it?" she asked, the practical question belying the emotional turmoil beneath. "We could start by being honest with ourselves and each other," he suggested. "See where that leads us." Abigail nodded slowly. "I'd like that." The winter of 1878-1879 was one of the harshest in Nevada's memory. Heavy snows isolated the ranch for weeks at a time, but Abigail found she didn't mind. The close quarters allowed her relationship with Yates to develop naturally, without the pressure of outside judgment. They took things slowly, both aware of the delicate balance between their professional relationship and their growing personal connection. Some evenings they simply talked by the fire. Other times, they shared tentative touches, his hand covering hers, her head resting against his shoulder. By Christmas, it was clear to everyone on the ranch that something had changed between them. Miguel and Frank exchanged knowing glances but kept their observations to themselves, respecting the privacy of their employers. On Christmas Eve, after a simple but festive dinner with the ranch hands, Yates asked Abigail to walk with him despite the cold. Bundled in heavy coats, they made their way to a small rise overlooking the ranch, the full moon turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of silver. "I've been thinking about that job offer from California," Yates said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Abigail's heart sank. "Have you decided to take it?" "No." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I wrote to decline. My place is here, Abigail. With you, if you'll have me." She searched his face in the moonlight, finding nothing but sincerity in his steady gaze. "What are you saying, Yates?" "I'm saying I love you," he replied simply. "And if you'll give me the honor of becoming my wife, I promise to spend every day trying to make you happy." Joy bubbled up inside her, unexpected and overwhelming. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally broke apart, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring yet," he apologized. "Didn't want to presume." Abigail laughed, the sound bright in the still winter night. "I don't need a ring, just you." They were married in early February by a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch during a brief thaw. It was a simple ceremony with only Miguel and Frank as witnesses, but to Abigail, it was perfect, free from the judgment and expectations that had clouded her first marriage. As winter gave way to spring, the ranch flourished under their joint care. Abigail's vegetable garden expanded, and Yates implemented new breeding methods that promised to improve their cattle stock. Together, they built something neither had dared hope for, a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love. In April, when the first wildflowers began to carpet the valley, Abigail realized she had missed her monthly courses. After a second month passed without change, she consulted the midwife in a small settlement 15 miles from the ranch. The confirmation of her pregnancy left her reeling with conflicting emotions, joy mixed with fear, hope tempered by memories of past disappointment. She had never conceived during her 7 years with Thomas, a failure that had defined her in Owyhee's eyes. On the ride home, she wondered how to tell Yates. Would he be excited? Worried? They had never discussed children, both assuming perhaps that it wasn't a possibility for her. She found him in the barn, mending a saddle by lantern light. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, his face broke into the warm smile that still made her heart skip. "There you are," he said, setting aside his work. "How was Mrs. Blackburn? Did she have that tonic you were looking for?" Abigail took a deep breath. "She did, but that's not why I went to see her." She moved closer, suddenly nervous. "Yates, I'm with child." For a moment he seemed frozen, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then he crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a joyous embrace. "A baby?" he asked, setting her down gently, his hands cradling her face. "We're having a baby," Abigail nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're happy then?" "Happy," Yates laughed, the sound echoing in the rafters. "Abigail, I'm overjoyed. This is a blessing beyond anything I could have hoped for." "But what if something goes wrong?" she whispered, giving voice to her deepest fear. "What if I lose it?" "In Owyhee they said I was cursed." "Stop," Yates said firmly. "Owyhee was wrong about you, wrong about everything. You are not cursed, Abigail Keller. You're the greatest blessing of my life, and this child is a miracle, not a test." His certainty washed over her, easing fears that had taken root years ago. "I love you," she said, leaning into his embrace. "And I love you," he replied, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Both of you." News of Abigail's pregnancy reached Owyhee by summer, carried by the same gossip networks that had once condemned her. Curiosity brought visitors, some genuinely pleased for her, others clearly skeptical and watching for signs of failure. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Holloway remarked during an ostensibly social call. "After all those years with Thomas, Well, some might call it a miracle, or proof that the problem wasn't with me after all, Abigail replied evenly, pouring tea with a steady hand. Mrs. Holloway had the grace to look embarrassed. I suppose we were rather hard on you, she admitted. The town, I mean. You were, Abigail agreed, offering no absolution. She had forgiven Owyhee its cruelties, but she hadn't forgotten them. As her body changed, Abigail found herself marveling at the process. Yates treated her with a mixture of reverence and practical concern, insisting she rest more but never suggesting she was fragile. You're the strongest woman I know, he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, his hand resting on her growing belly. This baby is lucky to have you for its mother. The words healed something deep inside her, a wound inflicted by years of being told she was somehow deficient as a woman. In Yates's eyes, she was enough, more than enough. She was essential. In late November, as the first snows began to fall, Abigail went into labor. Mrs. Blackburn had come to stay at the ranch 2 weeks earlier, anticipating the birth. Yates paced outside the bedroom door for hours, his worry evident in the lines etched on his face. It's taking too long, he said to Miguel, who had brought coffee and stayed to offer moral support. Something must be wrong. Births take time, Miguel assured him, his own experience as a father of 5 lending weight to his words. Miss Abigail is strong, she will be fine. As dawn broke over the mountains, a thin cry pierced the silence of the ranch house. Moments later, Mrs. Blackburn opened the bedroom door, her tired face wreathed in smiles. Congratulations, Mr. Keller, she said. You have a son. Yates stumbled into the room to find Abigail propped up against the pillows, her face exhausted but radiant as she cradled a small bundle against her chest. Come meet your son, she said softly. Approaching the bed with reverence, Yates gazed down at the tiny red face peering out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, the same deep blue as his father's. He's perfect, Yates whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. Just like his mother. Abigail smiled, tears of joy streaming down her face. We need a name for him. Yates considered for a moment. What about James, after the man who brought us together, James Thomas Keller, Abigail suggested, to honor both the past and the future. Yates nodded, his throat tight with emotion. It's a fine name for a fine boy. The winter passed in a blur of nighttime feedings and newfound joys. Little James thrived, growing stronger each day. By spring, he was a chubby, cheerful baby who delighted in watching the world around him. In April, a letter arrived from Owyhee. The town was holding its annual Founders' Day celebration and had specifically invited the Keller family to attend. Abigail's first instinct was to decline, but Yates suggested they consider it. Might be good to show them how wrong they were, he said, bouncing James on his knee. Show off this handsome fellow. Abigail hesitated. What if they're unkind? Yates's expression softened. Then we leave. But I think you might be surprised. Time has a way of changing perspectives. And so, on a bright May morning, they loaded the wagon and made the journey to Owyhee. James, now 6 months old, was dressed in his finest clothes, his dark curls combed neatly under a tiny hat. The town had decorated Main Street with bunting and flowers. Tables laden with food lined the street, and a band played cheerful tunes in the town square. As Abigail and Yates walked through the crowd, James perched on his father's hip. Heads turned and conversations paused. Reverend Miller was the first to approach them, his hands extended in greeting. Mrs. Keller, or should I say Mrs. Preston Keller, we're so pleased you could join us today. Thank you for the invitation, Reverend, Abigail replied, surprised by his warmth. This is my husband, Yates, and our son, James. The Reverend beamed at the baby, who regarded him solemnly with large blue eyes. "A fine boy. God's blessings are evident in your family." Throughout the day, Abigail was struck by the change in how the townspeople treated her. There was genuine warmth in their greetings, sincere admiration for her son. Even Eunice Blackburn and Martha Winters, once her harshest critics, cooed over James and complimented his healthy appearance. "Your ranch must agree with you," Mrs. Holloway observed as they shared lemonade in the shade. "You look happier than I've ever seen you." "I am," Abigail acknowledged. "I've found where I belong." As evening approached and they prepared to head home, Abigail found herself unexpectedly emotional. Owyhee had once been a place of pain and judgment, but today had offered a kind of healing she hadn't known she needed. "You were right," she told Yates as they settled James, now sleeping, in the wagon for the journey home. "People can change," he smiled, wrapping an arm around her waist. "So can places. So can lives. So can hearts," she added, thinking of her own transformation from the broken widow who had left Owyhee almost 2 years ago to the confident woman she had become. The years that followed brought more changes to Preston Keller Ranch. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined their family 18 months after James. Then came another son, Samuel, 2 years later. Each child was celebrated as the blessing they were, each one proof that Abigail had never been cursed, merely waiting for the right time and the right love. By 1885, the ranch had nearly doubled in size and productivity. Yates's innovative breeding techniques and Abigail's expanding gardens had made them one of the most successful operations in the county. They employed a dozen ranch hands now, and had built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, Yates surprised Abigail with a special gift, a locket containing miniature portraits of their 3 children. "To remind you always of the family we've built together," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "As if I could forget," she teased, but her eyes were serious as she added, "I never thought I'd have this, Yates. A husband who loves me, children of my own, a place where I truly belong." "You deserve all of it and more," he replied, pulling her close. "The town called you cursed, but I always knew better. You're my blessing, Abigail, my greatest blessing." Standing in his embrace, watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together, Abigail felt a contentment that went bone deep. Owyhee had been wrong about many things, but most of all it had been wrong about her. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't barren. She wasn't less than. She was Abigail Keller, wife, mother, rancher, a woman who had found her place in the world not by conforming to others' expectations, but by having the courage to forge her own path. And as the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her here to this place, this life, this love. In the end, what others had seen as her greatest failure had led her to her greatest joy. The judgment of Owyhee had driven her to a new beginning. The loss of one dream had opened the door to another, better one. And the cowboy who had called her his blessing had helped her discover that she had been a blessing all along, to herself, to him, and to the family they had created together.